My name's Rustin, the pastor here at Faith Connection Covenant Church, and I invite you to join me this morning. Grab a Bible, grab a cup of coffee, and maybe even grab a friend, and let's sit down and continue a conversation that we've been having for the last few weeks. But before we do, I just want to have a quick announcement and reminder that next week, next Sunday on the 31st at 9:30, we are going to be meeting at Faith Connection's church parking lot. And things are going to be done a little bit differently. And as we get closer to that, I'll release some more details, as I don't want to go into them here. And I've released a video that briefly talked about it. But we will be meeting. We've come up with a plan that we feel will keep everyone safe and everyone feeling comfortable and not put into a situation where they're doing anything they don't feel comfortable with, and that we can have a little bit more of semblance of normalcy in worshiping together. I'm excited, and I hope you would be willing to join us next week. Bring a camping chair or a lawn chair, so if your vehicle is not conducive to sitting on a tailgate or in the bed or in it. And I'm looking forward to enjoying worship in person again. With that being said, this week, what we're going to be talking about and continuing our conversation on is a section of scripture where Jesus is talking about how we make our life rock solid, how the things we focus on, the things we wrap our minds around and build into our lives, the type of responses we take to the world around us and what we carry in our hearts, and how that lets us set our lives up as rock solid. It lets us set up our lives in such a way that even though life happens, even though storms will come, our life won't be shook to the core, and they'll still be standing because they're built upon solid Jesus teachings, Jesus principles that stand up regardless of what life throws at us. And last week we talked about the blessings and woes. It's really the first section where Jesus is describing this kingdom. All right, his mission was to spread the good news of the kingdom of God. And this good news of this kingdom, this place where the king has dominion, where God's will is fully done. This kingdom, Jesus begins describing in a series of blessings and woes. And it's inverted from how we would normally think about it, because it talks about if you're poor, you're actually blessed, and if you're rich, woe to you. And as you begin digging in and beginning thinking through why Jesus would say this, it becomes apparent that he's describing a culture and a society that is not built upon the exploitation of others. And it, in fact, is trying to invert itself and is instead trying to be built in such a way that we lift each other up and care for each other. And it's amazing the type of kingdom he is describing. And it forces us to look in our heart and examine our actions and to begin to rethink how we view life and what we stand for, what we stand against, and what we're for and what we're against. And he continues on in this kind of train of thought and this thread as he talks about loving our enemies. So today in Scripture, we're going to be in Luke 6, just one section behind where we were last week, verses 27 through 36. But in order to really kind of get a running start at this, in order to really understand the framework to be able to put this section of Scripture in, we're going to read the last verse first, verse 36. We're going to read it first, and then we'll hop up the top and read it all the way back down through. And I'm just going to read a verse or two and stop, and we'll talk a little bit. And after we kind of we'll try to make some conclusions, and we'll try to make some applications. And then my hope is to leave you with a question that you will be wrestling with for a few days that is going to challenge you to change your behavior in an area of your life in regards to someone else or towards a group of people. So, with that being said, I want to first read Luke 6, verse 36. Be merciful, just as your Father is merciful, right? This entire section, the end stone that kind of encapsulates all of that, is Jesus saying, be merciful because God is merciful. Because we as Christians, we have the capacity to show mercy, not because we're outstanding people with high character, but because we believe that God has shown us the ultimate mercy in Jesus, his sacrifice on the cross, and then God's display of his capacity and power and willingness to undo all that is wrong in this world by bringing him back after 3 days dead in the grave. And if God can extend that mercy to us for all the things we're constantly doing and the ways in which we have fallen short of his hope for us and the ways in which we've twisted this world to be far less than he hoped for, if he could extend mercy to us who were working against his will and still at times work against his will, then we have the capacity to show mercy to others because it's been shown to us. Okay, now with that being said, let's go back to verse 27 and let's just start chunking this off and just going verse by verse. So verse 27, but I tell you who hear me, love your enemies, do good to those who hate you, bless those who curse you, pray for those who mistreat you, right? And this is just starting off by proclaiming a characteristic of people, of way in which you could act, which is totally polar opposite from the world, right? Love your enemies, do good to those who hate you, bless those who curse you, pray for those who mistreat you. The reality is we want to do the exact opposite. We want to get even with those who have wronged us. We want to triumph over our enemies. We want to show up and put people in their place, right? Who have cursed us and maligned our reputation or said bad things about us. We want to get even. We want to take justice into our own hands. And right off the bat, Jesus is saying, actually, no. You, as my disciples, I want to show you a different way to exist, a different thing to fill your heart up with, so that when someone bumps you, this mercy spills out, as opposed to vengeance or an attempt to get even or attempt to put them into place. Okay? And this is very different than how the world would have us act, right? How many stories and how many movies operate around a revenge plot line or a vigilante justice plot line? We get excited about that because that's something that resonates with what we desire to happen in our hearts, of us out on top against impossible odds. And Jesus is saying, actually, and he's setting it up so that actually the way we change the world is to follow in his footsteps, which was not to show everyone up who was sinful, was not to put everyone in their place who had done wrong and wrong against him, but was actually to show amazing and incomprehensible mercy and grace, even especially when people don't deserve it. Let's continue on. And Jesus starts breaking this down into specifics. 29, if someone strikes you on one cheek, turn to him also. If someone strikes you on the cheek, don't get even. Don't escalate past where they can escalate. Don't pull your conceal and carry weapon out. Turn the other cheek. If someone takes your cloak, do not stop him from taking your tunic. Go to everyone who asks you, and if anyone takes what belongs to you, do not demand it back. Don't demand those things which have been forcibly stolen from me. Don't demand it back. Don't put things in place to keep people from stealing from me. What are you talking about, Jesus? Do to others as you would have them do to you. Now let's remember, right, the end stone, the end place that Jesus is bringing this entire discussion is to mercy. So let's go through an example that unfortunately happens in rural America, in Kansas, in Washington, Kansas. Let's play out the scenario where someone has become addicted to meth. It happens. It's the reality of the world we're in. Their life is so horrible and so bad, and they've got so much going on in their head that they would rather be spun up on meth and experiencing that than the world around them. And then they get hooked, and they can't stop, and it's in them. And eventually they run out of the resources and the capacity to make the resources in order to get more. And so what happens? Eventually, many times, not always, but sometimes they end up stealing because all they can think about, they've been consumed and they're being controlled by this addiction that is operating and letting them escape from their reality. And Jesus is asking that instead of us seeking justice, justice is not bad. Justice is good. And justice is one of those qualities of God that we're aspire to and as a society we want. But what does that person need after they've been caught stealing? What do they need? If you were in that place, what would you need? Rehab, support, an opportunity and a path forward that would let them dig themselves out of the hole emotionally and socially and resource-wise that they've dug themselves into. They're not there because they want to be there. But Jesus is pushing us beyond our own sense of justice and vengeance in order to be able to see the people on the other side as people that are there because sometimes they're a victim also. Now, this is a very broad stroke, right? There's a lot of assumptions that I make in telling a story like that. But I've seen it. And the reality is, if we think about it, many of us have known multiple people who have fallen into that type of situation. It might not be meth. It might be another addiction. It might be another situation. But people who are just begging for a hand, they're asking for a loan. Those people who are reduced to a place where they're stealing, and those who are lashing out in violence. Jesus is not just calling for us to get justice, to get even, to get an upper hand, to place ourselves in such a situation that no one would dare do those types of things against us. He is asking us and calling for us to do what he did when he looked down upon the world and had compassion and extended grace when the world did not need it. And he died on its behalf, sacrificing of himself for the benefit of the world. Right? It makes sense that if he is who we would call is our master, all right, who we are discipling after, the person we are walking in his footsteps, it makes sense that he would ask us to do the same thing. To stop looking at the world as if it's trying to take these things from us and us being a victim. But look at those who are flailing in the world as being victims of society and culture and their life situation, and to respond with mercy. Am I saying that if you're in an abusive situation, you stay there? No. Am I saying that it is never right to defend yourself? Absolutely not. But what I am saying is that Jesus is calling for the predominant emotion that is controlling how you act towards people who are in these horrible, hard places is that of mercy, right? Because he came to change the world, and he sent us out to do likewise. And how Jesus changed the world was with grace and mercy, and not with vengeance and over-escalation and putting them in their place. And this is countercultural. This is against even the Midwest tough, macho culture we live in at times. But it's what Jesus is asking us to do. And so, if we're going to follow him, we have to earnestly and honestly wrestle with what this means for us as individuals, as a church, as voters in a society, and as even a country to some degree, right? And this is a highly nuanced situation as we deal with all these different theoretical situations. But what we can say for sure is that Jesus desires his people to operate with mercy and grace, and not some of the other things that we often tend to elevate in ourselves. So let's continue on. Verse 32. If you love those who love you, what credit is that to you? Even sinners love those who love them. And if you do good to those who are good to you, what credit is that to you? Even sinners do that. And if you lend to those from whom you expect repayment, what credit is that to you? Even sinners lend to sinners, expecting to be repaid in full. If our actions around these areas of violence and lending and theft if our response to these things are undistinguishable from the world around us, then we're not following Jesus. We might be attending a service on a Sunday morning to make ourselves feel good, or because we wanted to raise our kids in a good Christian church, but we're not following Jesus if our responses is the same as the world around us, because he's calling us to have more and differing responses. Verse 35. But love your enemies, do good to them. It doesn't stop there. Love does not mean you like a person always. All right? Love and liking are two different words, two different meanings. We've twisted it in our world and our culture. Love means simply the actions and attitudes that you take towards another person. And that you will act and behave in such a way it's to their benefit and not their detriment. And Jesus is saying, love your enemies. Be merciful. Have grace towards them. Don't tear them down. Don't get vengeance against them. But love them. Okay, let's continue on. Love your enemies, do good to them, and lend to them without expecting to get anything back. Then your reward will be great, and you'll be the sons of the Most High, because he is kind to the ungrateful and wicked. And we talked about this briefly, right? The fact that God had mercy and was graceful and gracious to us, even when we worked against him and we were pulling this world away from his desire and plan and will for it. He still sent his son. And when we act in that way, we earn a reward. Might not be now, but it will be in this kingdom of heaven. It will build interest there. And God calls us to be godly, to be like him. Jesus is calling his disciples to be like him. And we're right back to that last verse where it says, be merciful just as your Father is merciful, right? We can be, and we're called to be, because the example that Jesus set for us, but we can be because we were shown mercy. We know what it's like. We've been forgiven of far more. Every single aspect and way in which we fall short, God has looked on that and given us a way to walk towards what He desires for us, instead of wallowing and continuing in the same patterns that this world has prescribed upon us. So let's break this down another way, okay? What Jesus is talking about is three areas, and He's talking about our response to these things. He's talking about how we as Christians, as little Jesuses in this world, as little Christ, Christian, operate and respond to violence. How we respond to theft, and how we respond to loans, right? He's calling and asking us to look beyond just the act against us and to the other person and see them as someone to extend mercy to. People don't steal because they want to, that they want to be in a place that their life is so messed up that seems like a good idea. People end up in places where it seems like it's a good idea because their life is so messed up. Am I saying never press charge? I'm not giving any absolutes. What I am saying is simply what I feel Jesus is saying in these verses, and that is that He desires for His people to extend mercy because we had mercy extend to us. And that when people resort to violence, there's usually a reason. Oftentimes that's the way they grew up. That's the environment they were wrapped in. They're so backed into a corner, they don't have the capacity to respond any other way. And that's heartbreaking. And not that you can't defend yourself, and for sure defend your family and your kids. But if your response is exactly the same as the world around us, then we cannot honestly say that we're following Jesus in this. If we're not leading with mercy and desiring to find a way to be able to forgive and move forward, then we're not following Jesus in this. Now let's talk about loans, right? If someone is asking you for a hand up, Jesus is saying, give it to them. Help them come up with a way to get out of their situation. And while banks handle a lot of this these days, there is a reality. There are some areas of this country where they are underserviced by quality banks, and there's only paycheck lending and other types of predatory lending in place. And it's another example, like in the blessing and woe situation, where some are benefiting from exploitation of those who have the least. And as Christians, as followers of Jesus, that needs to break our heart. And that happens in America in many areas. Right? Remember, this is about us being different than how the world does things, right? Not only in order to be distinct from the world around us and to clearly identify as followers of Christ, but Jesus came to change the world, and He sent His disciples out to do likewise. Our answer, our response, our posture towards these things is different if we follow Jesus. And these aren't easy issues. Many of these are talking about personal affronts to our own person, our own family, our own livelihood. And yet Jesus is still saying our response must be different, because it's not about being right. It's not about being justified. Someone strikes us. We are justified in striking back, right? Legally, morally, it might even be right to do so. If someone has stolen from us or is stealing from us, we are right, and we can morally and justifiably step in and stop that. And we are within our rights and our personal justification to not lend and help others out who are asking for help because they don't deserve it. But it's not about being right. It's not about claiming the moral high ground and holding it over other people. It's not about being completely justified in our actions. It's about being like Jesus. And thank God, and I mean this fully, thank God, Jesus wasn't about just being right, moral, or justified. And that mercy and grace was how he responded to us who were in a horrible situation that we couldn't pull ourselves up out of. And maybe God is putting you in a place where someone can say, thank God for you, because you weren't brimming with vengeance, but you desired mercy and grace. So here's what we need to do. You and I, we've got to get off our moral high horse. That's Jesus' ground. He's moral, he's righteous, he is good, he was without blemish, right? That's his area. We've all fallen short. We've got to get off that moral high ground. Give it to Jesus, let him decide these things. We've got to stop making things and arguing about what's right or wrong, about what our liberties or our morals or our justifications are, and instead operate what is merciful, what extends grace towards those. And remember, grace is given when people don't deserve it, right? It's more than just this person has worked hard and they deserve a helping hand. No, grace is when they don't deserve it. Grace is doing it in such a way to those who can't do it for themselves. Otherwise, it's just what the world does. And remember that being right, that being absolutely moral or being justified in everything we can do doesn't change the world, right? We saw that. We saw the Pharisees. They operated that way. Did that change the world? Are we sitting here talking about sermons they've preached? Or teaching they've taught? No. Jesus did. And the way he changed it was unimaginable mercy and grace. And he's calling us to do the same thing in this world. And so, mercy and grace. How do we respond against violence? Mercy and grace. How do we respond against theft? Mercy and grace. How do we respond when someone's asking for a hand up out of the situation they're in and asking for a loan or for some help? Mercy and grace. And this extends to all things. How do we respond in this corona crisis? In this pandemic? Is it what is right? Is it what's moral? Is it what we're justified? Or what our liberties say we ought to do? Or do we ask and try to answer the question, what extends mercy? What shows grace to those around us? If we're following Jesus, the answer's pretty simple on which way we go. The logistics of the specifics need nuance, obviously. But what we have in our heart and how we proceed, it must be with mercy and grace. So here's the question. Here's what I want to leave you with to wrestle with, as if there wasn't enough already, right? Jesus is not easy. If he is, we're not really following him. He's so good, and he calls us to be so much more than we are. And that's all of us, because I for sure haven't gotten there, and none of us have. But here's a question that we need to, I need to, you need to wrestle with. Where do you need to be merciful? Where in your life do you need to be merciful instead of right? Right now, all of us are doing a lot of trying to claim right, trying to claim what is true, and we know what's right and what we ought to do, and we're taking that defensive stance from that place. We gotta stop. Where do we need to stop being right? Where do we need to start being merciful and full of grace? Thank you for joining me this morning. I look forward to next Sunday, and look forward to meeting in person, praying for you guys. And God bless. Have a great week.